A poor girl offers a ring to a young billionaire and says, "Please give me any amount, I need to save my mom." But when he reads the name engraved inside the ring, he begins to cry uncontrollably. The rain tapped against the window when Sophie woke up that morning. It wasn't the sound of the water that had woken her, but her mother's cough coming from the next room. It was the third night Jessica had spent with a fever. "Mum?" Sophie called, walking into the small bedroom. The weak light filtering through the cheap curtains revealed Jessica lying down, her face pale and her hair stuck to her forehead, damp with sweat. She opened her eyes with difficulty. "Good morning, my love." Her voice was faint. "Could you get Mom a glass of water?" Sophie ran to the kitchen. At 5 years old, she already knew how to manage on her own when needed. She filled the glass carefully so it wouldn't spill, carrying it with both hands to her mother's room. Jessica took a few sips and lay back down. "Are you feeling better today?" Sophie asked, touching her mother's forehead as she had seen Jessica do for her when she was sick. "I will be," Jessica smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I just need a bit more rest." Sophie knew it was more serious than her mother wanted to admit. She had overheard Jessica on the phone the previous night, talking to their neighbor about not being able to buy the medications the doctor at the free clinic had prescribed. "I'll draw a picture for you," Sophie said, going to get her colored pencils. In the tiny living room that also served as a kitchen, Sophie opened her school backpack. While searching for her drawing pad, she accidentally knocked over a pile of papers and envelopes Jessica kept on a shelf. Crouching to pick up the mess, her eyes landed on a small wooden box that had fallen from the top of the stack. She had never seen it before. Curiosity won out. Sophie opened the box, and her eyes lit up. Inside was a gold ring with a small blue stone that sparkled even in that weak light. It seemed magical, like something from a fairy tale. She held it up to the light and noticed something engraved inside. She tried to decipher the letters slowly. Jessica M. Moore. "It's Mom's," she whispered to herself. Sophie had never seen her mother wear any jewelry. In fact, they had so little that many times Jessica skipped meals so Sophie could eat. Where had this beautiful ring come from? Why was her mother hiding it? A thought crossed her mind. Crystal clear. The ring must be worth money. Money enough to buy the medicine. Sophie looked toward her mother's room. The door was closed, and she could hear Jessica's heavy breathing. She was finally asleep. Determined, Sophie put the ring in the pocket of her coat and quietly grabbed the keys. At the door, she hesitated. She had never gone out alone before. Jessica always said it was dangerous, but now her mom needed her. She took a deep breath and slipped out into the street. The world outside seemed huge. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray. Sophie walked along the wet sidewalks, passing people who barely noticed the small girl. She didn't really know where to go. She had heard about places that bought jewelry, but she had no idea where to find them. After walking a few blocks, Sophie reached the city center. Shops, restaurants, and people in a hurry. Her eyes roamed over the crowd, looking for someone who seemed kind enough to help. That was when she saw him, a tall man, dark hair streaked with a bit of gray at the temples. He wore a gray suit that looked expensive and carried a leather briefcase. He walked alone, checking his expensive watch, a serious expression on his face. Something about him caught Sophie's attention. Maybe it was the way he walked, as if carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. Or maybe it was just because he looked like he had money, and money was exactly what she needed. Sophie took a deep breath and crossed the sidewalk, stopping in front of the man. He almost bumped into her, so lost in thought he was. "Please, sir," her voice came out trembling. "Give me any amount, I need to save my mommy." Mark Sullivan looked down, surprised to find a little girl with brown hair and eyes far too serious for her age. For a moment, he thought about continuing on. He was already late for an important meeting, and the city was full of people asking for money. "I'm sorry, little one, but—" Sophie held out her open hand, showing the ring. "Please, it's pretty. It's worth money. My mom is very sick." Distracted, Mark took the object to look at it more closely, and that was when the world stopped. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the ring. He recognized it immediately. The small blue sapphire, the delicate shape, the inscription inside. He turned it toward the light to confirm what his heart already knew. Jessica M. Moore. The air left his lungs as if he had been punched. Tears sprang to his eyes unexpectedly, and he turned his face away so the girl wouldn't notice, pretending to wipe something off. That name. How many years had passed? 6? 7? A name he had tried to bury, along with all the memories and feelings that came with it. Mark looked at the girl with new eyes, wavy brown hair, like Jessica's, the stubborn jawline. And there was something in her gaze, something familiar that made his heart clench. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Sophie," she replied, wary of the change in his demeanor. Sophie, a name Jessica had once said she would like to give a daughter. Mark felt his stomach drop. "And your mum? Is she Jessica Moore?" The girl's eyes widened. "You know my mum?" Mark didn't answer. His mind was doing quick calculations. The girl's age, the time since he and Jessica had broken up. "Where's your mum?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "At home. Sick. I wanted to sell the ring to buy medicine." Mark knelt down to Sophie's eye level, holding the ring so tightly his fingers went white. "Take me to her." It wasn't a request, it was almost a plea. Sophie hesitated. Her mother had always told her not to trust strangers, but this man knew her mum, and he had sad eyes. Besides, she had already snuck out and had no idea what else to do. Maybe this man could really help. "Is it far?" Mark asked, already mentally cancelling all his day's appointments. "Not too far," Sophie pointed. "That way?" Mark took Sophie's small hand and let her guide him. With each step, his heart beat faster. The important meeting, the contracts, the empire he had built, all of it vanished from his mind. Now there was only the ring in his pocket and the little girl's hand in his. The route Sophie had walked alone seemed much shorter on the way back. Soon they arrived at an old building with peeling paint and a broken elevator. Sophie led him up the stairs to the 4th floor. "Here," she said, stopping in front of a door marked 403. Mark felt his heart in his throat as Sophie unlocked the door. The apartment was smaller than he had imagined. A living room that barely fit a worn sofa, and a small table, a tiny kitchen, and 2 doors that he assumed were the bedrooms. "Mom is in there." Sophie pointed to one of the doors. Mark approached slowly. Part of him wanted to run, pretend none of this was happening, go back to his organized, controlled life, but his feet carried him to the door. He knocked softly. There was no response. "She must be sleeping," Sophie explained, passing by him and opening the door. "Mom, I brought someone who knows you." The room was small, containing only a bed, a nightstand, and a dresser. On the bed, covered by a thin sheet, lay Jessica. Mark felt a jolt when he saw her, thinner than he remembered, her face pale, her hair disheveled. But it was still her. It was still Jessica. She opened her eyes slowly, disoriented by the fever. "Sophie, who are you talking to, honey?" Her voice was faint. Then her eyes found Mark. For a moment, she seemed not to recognize him. Then comprehension arrived, and with it, shock. "Mark!" She tried to sit up, but was too weak. "Don't strain yourself," he said, moving closer to the bed. "Sophie found me with this." He showed the ring. Jessica looked at her daughter, confused. "Sophie, where did you—" She began, but was interrupted by a new wave of coughing. Mark didn't need anything else to make his decision. He stepped forward and touched Jessica's forehead. It was burning up. "So you need a doctor," he said firmly. "I'm taking you to the hospital." "No," Jessica protested weakly. "We can't afford—" "I'll pay," Mark interrupted. "And it's not negotiable." He turned to Sophie. "Grab some things for your mom. A change of clothes, a toothbrush. Quick." Sophie, sensing the urgency in his voice, ran to do what was asked. Mark looked at Jessica, trying to keep his composure and hide how shaken he was. But seeing her like this, ill, in such a modest place, so different from the life he had imagined she would have, and with a daughter who might be— "Why did you come back?" Jessica asked, her voice almost a whisper. Mark didn't answer. How could he explain that he had never really left? That even after all these years, after everything that happened, her name could still stop his heart. Sophie returned with a small bag. "I got Mum's things, and the medicine that ran out." Mark nodded, taking the bag. Then, carefully, he helped Jessica stand. She was far too light, fragile. He lifted her in his arms effortlessly. "Oh, you don't have to," she protested, but her head fell against his chest, too weak to resist. "Sophie, open the door," Mark asked, and the girl ran ahead. They went down the stairs slowly, Mark carrying Jessica as if she were made of glass. On the street, he signaled for a taxi, which stopped immediately. "To St. Mary's Hospital," he instructed the driver. During the ride, Mark held Jessica in his arms. Sophie sat beside him, looking worriedly at her mother. A strange family reflected in the taxi window. "Who is he, Mom?" Sophie asked in a low voice. Jessica looked at Mark, her eyes meeting his for the first time in years. "An old friend," was all she said. Mark felt the weight of those words. An old friend. Was that how she saw him now, after everything they had once been to each other? But he said nothing. This wasn't the time. For now, the important thing was for Jessica to get the medical care she needed. The rest, the questions, the explanations, the lost years, could wait. The taxi pulled up to the hospital entrance, and Mark stepped out carrying Jessica, with Sophie right behind him. In the emergency room, just a word from him was enough to get Jessica immediate treatment. While doctors and nurses surrounded Jessica, rolling her inside on a stretcher, Sophie stayed by Mark's side in the waiting area. She looked up at the tall, serious man who somehow knew her mother and was now helping them. "Are you going to make Mommy better?" Mark looked into those big eyes, so trusting. Eyes that could be his in a face that was certainly Jessica's. A strange heaviness settled in his chest, guilt, regret, or something else without a name yet. "I'll do my best," he promised. Sitting side by side in the plastic chairs of the waiting room, Mark and Sophie waited for news. He glanced at the little girl every now and then, looking for traits, confirmations, clues of a truth he still didn't dare to confront fully. Meanwhile, the engagement ring weighed in his pocket, a symbol of promises made and broken. A past he thought was buried, but that now, through a simple encounter on a busy sidewalk, had resurfaced and turned his life upside down. Mark knew nothing would be the same again. The important meeting, his business, the comfortable yet empty life he led, all felt distant now, as if they belonged to someone else. Here, beside this small girl with eyes far too serious for her age, he was back in the only place his heart had truly inhabited, near Jessica Moore. He just didn't know if there would be a place for him in this new life he was discovering. If the mistakes of the past could be forgiven, if lost time could be recovered, but for now, that didn't matter. What mattered was being there, helping in some way. The rest, the truths, the difficult conversations, the uncertain future would come later. For now, there was only the silent wait and the unasked question hanging in the air. Who was Sophie Moore? Really? Mark spent the entire night in the hospital waiting room's uncomfortable chair. His neck hurt and his back complained, but he couldn't leave. Every half hour he'd get up and walk to the door of the room where Jessica lay, just to check if she was still sleeping. Sophie had finally fallen asleep next to him, her small head resting on his arm. Mark didn't dare move for fear of waking her. Looking at that child's peaceful sleeping face, he saw even more similarities. The shape of her nose, the curve of her eyebrows, features that made him hold his breath. Breakfast was handed out by the hospital staff, and the smell of toast and coffee woke Sophie. She rubbed her eyes and glanced around, disoriented for a moment. "Mommy?" she asked, still sleepy. "She's still asleep," Mark answered gently. "The doctor said she'll be better soon." Sophie nodded, accepting the information with a child's simple trust. Mark offered her a sandwich and a juice he had bought. "Are you hungry?" She took the sandwich, her eyes lighting up, but she didn't bite into it right away. Instead, she looked at the door of the room where her mother was. "Will Mom eat when she wakes up?" she asked. "Sure, they'll bring her food too." Sophie seemed uncertain, then tore the sandwich in half, saving a piece in her coat pocket. "What are you doing?" Mark asked, intrigued. "Keeping it for Mom," she answered, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "She's always hungry when she wakes up." Something in Mark's chest tightened. Such a small automatic gesture, a 5-year-old already so used to sharing everything, thinking of her mother before herself. "You can eat it all," he said gently. "I can buy another one for your mom when she wakes up." Sophie looked at him with suspicion, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. "Are you sure? It costs money." "I'm sure," Mark affirmed, holding back the urge to ask more, to understand how much these two had suffered. As they ate, Mark tried to find a way to talk to Sophie. It was strange. He could negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts without hesitation, but he didn't know how to speak to a child, especially if that child might be his daughter. "So," he began, clearing his throat, "do you go to school?" Sophie nodded, finishing her bite. "Yes, I do. I'm in pre-K. Mom works while I'm there." "And what does your mom do?" "She cleans houses," Sophie said, taking a sip of juice. 3 different houses. And at night, after she puts me to bed, she sews things to sell." Mark absorbed this information like a blow. Jessica cleaning houses, sewing late into the night to support her daughter. Such a different life from the promising career she had when they met. "And on weekends, what do you do?" Sophie's eyes lit up. "We go to the park, it's free. Mom brings a blanket, and we have a picnic. Sometimes, if there's extra money, we buy ice cream," she continued, excitedly describing their Sunday trips to the park, how Jessica pushed her on the swing, the stories her mom invented about the clouds in the sky, small moments of happiness that cost nothing. "And on cold nights," Sophie went on, "we make a blanket fort in the living room. Mom lights candles because it's cheaper than using the lamp, and we tell princess stories." With each of Sophie's words, a new detail of their simple life emerged, of the daily sacrifices Jessica made. Mark thought of his own penthouse apartment, expensive restaurant dinners, designer clothes. All that wealth seemed empty compared to blanket forts and candlelit princess tales. "Your mom sounds amazing," he said, feeling the inadequacy of his words. "She's the best mom in the world," Sophie said firmly, "but she gets sad sometimes." Mark leaned forward slightly, trying not to appear too eager. "Sad? Why?" Sophie shrugged, an unexpectedly adult gesture for someone so small. "Sometimes I wake up at night and see her crying. When I ask what happened, she says she got dust in her eye. But there's no dust at night, right?" "No," Mark agreed, feeling a lump in his throat. "I don't think there is. And she keeps a photo in her drawer," Sophie went on. "Once I saw it when I was looking for socks. It's a picture of her with a man. They're both smiling a lot." Mark felt his heart race. He knew exactly which picture it was, taken in front of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. He had planned to propose to her on that trip, but ended up postponing it, unsure, a mistake that now seemed monumental. "Do you know who the man in the photo is?" he asked, his voice nearly a whisper. Sophie shook her head. "I've never seen him before. Mom doesn't talk about him." Silence fell between them. Mark looked at the child, seeing so many of Jessica's features, but now noticing other things, like the shape of her jaw, so much like his own, or how she frowned when she was thinking, exactly like he did. "Do you have kids?" Sophie asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. "No," he answered, feeling the weight of that single word. "I don't." "So you're alone?" "Yes," Mark admitted. "I have a big house, but I live alone." Sophie considered that for a moment, tilting her head. "That must be sad. Mom says we may not have much, but we have each other, and that's what matters." The child's simple words hit Mark with more force than any eloquent speech could. Throughout his adult life, surrounded by professional success and material comforts, he had never filled the void left by Jessica. He had never found anything that mattered as much as what they once shared. And now, listening to Sophie, he was beginning to realize what he might have missed out on. Not just Jessica, but this child. This clever, caring child who saved half a sandwich for her mom and thought blanket forts were magical. "Your mom must be very brave," he said. "She is," Sophie agreed proudly. "When we don't have money for the rent, she says she'll figure something out, and she always does. When I get sick, she stays up all night with me. And even when she's really tired, she never forgets to read me a story before bed." With every new revelation, Mark felt something stirring inside him. Guilt, regret, but also admiration. Admiration for Jessica, for how she had raised this wonderful child alone, facing hardships he could hardly imagine. "And your dad?" The words slipped out before he could stop them. "Do you know him?" Sophie shook her head. "Mom says he left before he knew about me." Mark felt the impact of those simple words, "before he knew about me," meaning Jessica had never told him, never given him the chance to choose, to take responsibility. Or maybe she had tried. Maybe he had been too busy with his own ambition, his own pain after their breakup, to truly listen. "But she says he's not a bad person," Sophie added, surprising Mark. "He just made different choices." "Your mom said that he's not bad?" "Yes. I asked once if he was like the villains in stories. She said no. He just chose a different path than ours." Mark swallowed hard, moved by Jessica's generosity in speaking about him to her daughter. She could have painted a terrible picture, filled Sophie with resentment. Instead, she left the door open for the future, for the possibility of redemption. "I'd like to meet him someday," Sophie said, fiddling with her juice straw, "just to know what he's like." Mark couldn't trust his voice to respond. Instead, he just nodded, feeling his heart open in a new, unfamiliar way. That little girl in front of him was no longer just Jessica's daughter, a coincidence or a painful reminder of the past. She was Sophie, her complete person, with dreams and needs and a surprising wisdom for someone so young. A child who had lived with very little, but who understood what truly mattered. A nurse appeared at the door of Jessica's room. "The patient is awake and asking for her daughter." Sophie jumped off the chair, excited. "Can I go see Mommy?" "Of course, dear," the nurse smiled. Before entering the room, Sophie turned to Mark. "Are you going to stay here until Mommy gets better?" There was so much hope in that simple question, so much trust in her eyes, that Mark felt something shift inside him, a decision forming, clear and unavoidable. "I'll stay," he promised. "For as long as it takes." Sophie smiled, the kind of smile that lights up the whole world, and then ran into her mother's room, leaving Mark with his thoughts, his discoveries, and the start of a way back home he didn't even know he was seeking. Jessica settled into the hospital bed, feeling slightly better after the IV medication. The fever had gone down, and her mind was clearer. She looked at Sophie, who was sleeping curled up in the armchair by the bed, and smiled. Her daughter, always so strong. She glanced around the room. It was simple but clean and comfortable, better than any public hospital where she would normally be treated. How did she end up here? Her memories were jumbled. She remembered being at home, burning with fever, and then someone carrying her. A familiar voice. A face she thought she had dreamed. The door to the room opened slowly, and Jessica turned her head, expecting to see a nurse. Her heart froze momentarily. Mark Sullivan stood in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee. Older than in her memories, with a bit of grey at his temples, but undeniably him. The same tall posture, the same green eyes, the same confident air, except now there was something different in his gaze, a hesitation she had never seen before. "You're awake," he said, his voice low so as not to wake Sophie. Jessica felt a rush of emotions, shock, fear, anger, and something deeper she refused to name. Her body tensed, hands gripping the sheet tightly. "What are you doing here?" The words came out harsher than she intended. Mark entered the room, closing the door softly behind him. He kept his distance as if he knew his presence wasn't welcome. "Sophie found me," he explained, his eyes briefly resting on the sleeping girl. "In the street. She was trying to sell this." He took the ring from his pocket and placed it on the bedside table. Jessica looked at the piece of jewelry as though it were a venomous snake. "She shouldn't have done that," she muttered. more to herself than to him. She was worried about you. She said she needed money for medicine. Jessica closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the sting of tears behind her eyelids. Of course Sophie had done that. Her daughter, always trying to protect her, even though she was so young. That still doesn't explain why you're here, Jessica said, opening her eyes again, avoiding Mark's gaze. You could have called an ambulance and left. Mark took a step forward, then stepped back again as if treading on dangerous ground. You were very sick. Pneumonia, according to the doctors. I couldn't just leave. Of course you could. Jessica let out a dry, humorless laugh. You were always good at walking away, Mark. The accusation hung in the air between them. Mark didn't respond immediately, taking a sip of coffee to buy some time. I know you have every right to be angry, he finally said. I'm not angry. The icy tone of her voice contradicted her words. It's been so long, I don't even care anymore. A lie. They both knew it was a lie. The tension between them was thick, loaded with years of unspoken words, stored resentments and unhealed pain. Sophie stirred in the armchair, mumbling something in her sleep. Jessica and Mark both looked at her simultaneously, their faces softening at the sight of the child. Sophie likes you, Jessica said, as if it were an accusation. She's an amazing girl, Mark replied sincerely. Smart, sensitive. Jessica nodded slightly, a brief moment of agreement. Yes, she is. Silence fell over them again, heavy with everything left unsaid. Mark leaned against the wall, maintaining his distance but not showing any intention of leaving. How long? He finally asked. How long what? How long after we broke up did you find out about her? Jessica glanced at Sophie, judging whether it was safe to speak. The girl continued to sleep deeply. 3 weeks, she said, voice almost a whisper. I found out 3 weeks later. Mark closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the blow. Why didn't you tell me? The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Jessica felt her anger surge again, a hot wave sweeping everything before it. Tell you? She struggled to keep her voice low. After what you did, after how it all ended. Tell you? She struggled to keep her voice low. After what you did, after how it all ended. I had the right to be respected, to be loved, to not be betrayed, Jessica said, feeling tears threatening to fall, though she refused to cry in front of him. Don't talk to me about rights, Mark. He ran a hand through his hair, an expression of frustration she knew all too well. It was a mistake, the biggest mistake of my life. Which one? Cheating or letting me go? The question dripped with venom, and Jessica knew it. But 6 years of raising a daughter alone, of sleepless nights, unpaid bills, and abandoned dreams had earned her the right to be bitter. Both, Mark answered in a low voice. I was young, stupid, and selfish. And I've paid the price every day since. Jessica let out a laugh, cold, devoid of joy. You paid the price, with your penthouse and imported car. She looked at the expensive suit he wore. Forgive me if I don't shed tears for you. Mark didn't defend himself. Instead, he looked again at Sophie. She's my daughter, isn't she? Jessica didn't answer immediately. Part of her wanted to lie, to deny him that certainty, that connection. But what would be the point? Sophie was there, living proof, with her green eyes so much like his. Yes, she finally admitted. She's your daughter. The impact of the confirmation seemed to hit Mark physically. He staggered slightly, leaning more heavily against the wall. I have a daughter, he murmured, almost to himself. All this time. No, Jessica cut in firmly, her voice unwavering. You contributed genetic material. I have a daughter. I'm the one who rocked her every night. I'm the one who held her hand on her first day of school. I'm the one who worked 3 jobs so she could have the basics. The words were harsh, but Jessica couldn't contain her bitterness, not after everything she'd been through. You're right, Mark conceded, surprising her. You did all of that alone, and I can never make that up to you, but I'm here now. And what does that mean? Jessica asked warily. You think you can just show up after 6 years and suddenly be a father? That you can buy your way back into our lives? I'm not trying to buy anything, Mark said, frustration evident in his voice. I'm just trying to help. We don't need your help. Clearly, you do, he retorted, gesturing around the hospital room. You had pneumonia, Jessica. Sophie was so desperate that she went out alone to try to sell a ring. Jessica looked away, feeling the sting of truth in his words. Yes, they were struggling. Yes, it had been hard, almost impossible at times, but she had her pride, and it was all she had left after Mark left. What do you want, Mark? Money to ease your conscience? A formal introduction. Hello, Sophie. Here's your father who never bothered to look for you. I didn't know, he said through gritted teeth. How could I look for someone whose existence I didn't even know about? Jessica closed her eyes, exhausted. The medication still made her drowsy, and this conversation was draining what little energy she had. Go away, Mark. Thank you for bringing me to the hospital, but now leave. What about Sophie? What about her? She deserves to know who I am. Jessica looked at her sleeping daughter. Sophie always asked about her father. There was always that curiosity in her eyes whenever she saw other kids with their dads, that barely concealed wish to have what other children had. Maybe, she conceded, but not now, not like this. Mark nodded slowly, accepting the temporary defeat. I'll respect your decision, but I won't just disappear again, Jessica. You didn't disappear the first time, she corrected. I sent you away, and with good reason. The pain in his eyes was unmistakable, but Jessica refused to let it affect her. She had spent too long crying over Mark Sullivan. She had built walls around her heart, brick by brick, year after year. She wasn't going to let him tear them down in a single day. The doctors said you could be discharged tomorrow, Mark said, changing the subject. But you'll need to keep up the treatment at home. I can't pay for that, Jessica admitted, hating the vulnerability in her own voice. I've already taken care of it. I didn't ask. No, he interrupted. You didn't. Sophie did, and I won't deny her anything. Jessica bit her lip, torn between pride and practical need. For herself, she would have refused any help from Mark. But for Sophie, she swallowed her pride. Just the treatment, she yielded. Nothing more. Mark nodded, apparently satisfied with that small victory. I'll let you rest, he said, heading toward the door. I'll be outside if you need anything. Before Jessica could reply, Sophie stirred in the armchair, opening her sleepy eyes. Mr. Mark, she muttered, sitting up. You're still here. His face changed completely. All the fatigue, all the tension disappeared, replaced by a genuine smile Jessica hadn't seen in years. I am Sophie, he answered softly. I was just talking to your mum. Sophie turned to Jessica, her eyes lighting up. Mommy, you're better? I am, my love, Jessica smiled, opening her arms so her daughter could jump out of the chair to hug her. Mark watched them from the doorway, an outsider looking in on a world that could have been his. Jessica met his eyes over Sophie's head. There was no forgiveness there, not yet, but there was a silent truce, for the sake of the little girl they both loved, in their own way. I'll come back later, he said quietly, leaving the room. Jessica held Sophie tightly, burying her face in her daughter's hair to hide the tears that finally began to flow. Years of anger and hurt wouldn't vanish overnight. But for the first time, there was a small crack in the wall she had built, tiny, almost imperceptible, yet there, and through that crack, a single beam of light insisted on shining in. 3 days had passed since Mark and Jessica's confrontation. The doctor had recommended she stay in the hospital a bit longer to ensure the pneumonia was fully treated. Mark covered the costs of a private room, ignoring her protests. Each morning he arrived with coffee for Jessica and hot chocolate for Sophie, leaving the drinks on the bedside table with a polite good morning before stepping out to take work calls. When he returned, he always brought something new. Once it was simple flowers, daisies in a small vase. Another time, a children's book he'd spotted in a nearby bookstore. Jessica received all of it with a cold thank you, but initiated no conversation. She watched warily the interactions between Mark and Sophie. Part of her wanted to ban this closeness, to protect her daughter from potential disappointment. But another part, a part she refused to examine too closely, noticed how Sophie's eyes sparkled whenever Mark appeared. On the afternoon of the fourth day, Jessica was asleep, exhausted from her medication. Mark slipped quietly into the room, carrying a small bag. "Aye, Sophie," he whispered, sitting down in the chair next to the bed where the girl was flipping through an old magazine. "I brought something for you." Sophie's eyes widened as he took a box of colored pencils and a new sketch pad from the bag. Is it for me?" she asked softly, glancing at her sleeping mother, as if afraid the gift might vanish if Jessica woke up. "Of course," Mark smiled. "I thought we could do some drawing together. What do you think?" Sophie nodded eagerly, accepting the sketch pad carefully as if it were made of crystal. Mark noticed how she opened it slowly, savoring the smell of the new paper. "At school, we only have broken pencils," she said, opening the box of colored pencils. "And we have to share the paper." Mark felt that now familiar pang in his chest. It was as if every new detail of Sophie's life was a small blow, reminding him of everything he had missed and everything she had never had. "Well, these are all yours," he assured her. "No need to share." Sophie fixed him with a serious look, that same oddly adult gaze he'd seen a few times before. "But I like sharing. I just don't like when other kids break the crayons." Mark smiled, recognizing in those simple words the generous spirit he had noticed in Sophie from the start. "So, what do you like to draw?" he asked, pulling his chair closer. "Houses," Sophie replied readily. "I like drawing big houses with gardens. Let's draw one as then." For the next hour, they drew side by side. Sophie created a colorful house with a garden full of flowers, a swing hanging from a tree, and many windows. Mark tried to follow her lead, but his attempt clearly showed he was someone who hadn't drawn in decades. "How yours looks funny," Sophie remarked, without malice, looking at his skewed drawing. Mark laughed. "I was never very good at this." "That's okay. Mom says we don't have to be good at everything. We just have to try." Again, that simple wisdom caught him off guard. Mark glanced over at Jessica sleeping, wondering how many such lessons she had passed on to Sophie over the years, lessons he had missed. Sophie started a new drawing, her tongue peeking out of the corner of her mouth as she concentrated. Mark watched her, fascinated by each small gesture, each expression. He searched for traces of himself and found them, in the determined way she held her pencil, in the slight tilt of her head when she was thinking hard. "Do you work a lot?" Sophie asked suddenly, without lifting her eyes from the drawing. "Yes," Mark admitted. "Maybe too much." "Like Mom?" She nodded. "She works too much, too. Sometimes she falls asleep at her sewing machine." Mark glanced at Jessica's hands, noticing for the first time the small marks, needle pricks, calluses from manual labor, hands that had fought alone to build a life for Sophie. "Your mother is very strong," he observed. Sophie nodded. "She says we have to be strong when things get hard." They were silent for a few minutes, only the sound of pencils scratching the paper. Mark thought about all the times he had complained about work stress, long meetings, tiring trips, while living in absolute comfort. What did he really know about hardship? Sophie interrupted his thoughts, looking at him with that serious expression again. "Do you have kids?" The question surprised him, although perhaps it shouldn't have. It was natural for a child to ask an adult. But for Mark, it carried the weight of 6 years of unintentional absence. "No," he hesitated, feeling every heartbeat. "I never did." Sophie's eyes, so similar to his, studied him for a moment. Then she gave a sad little smile that made her seem 10 years older. "I never had a dad either." Mark felt the blow of those simple words. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat was tight with emotion. "Mom says he left before he knew about me," Sophie continued, returning to her drawing as if talking about the weather. "But sometimes I wonder if he'd think I'm nice." Mark swallowed hard, fighting the impulse to pull her into a hug and tell her everything right then. But he knew it wasn't his decision to make alone. Jessica was right. Sophie deserved to know, but not like this, not while everything was so fragile. "I'm sure he'd think you're amazing," Mark managed to say, his voice a bit rough. Sophie smiled, satisfied by his answer. "That's what Mom says too. She says any father would be proud of me." "Your mother's right," Mark agreed, glancing toward Jessica, still asleep. For a moment, he felt deep gratitude for how she'd raised such a remarkable child despite all the hardships and despite never telling him the truth. A child who, somehow, hadn't been poisoned against an absent father. "You can be my friend since you don't have kids," Sophie offered, pushing a few colored pencils toward him. "I picked your favorites." Mark picked up the pencils, blue, green, brown, and realized they were exactly the colors he would have chosen. "Thanks, Sophie. I'd love to be your friend." They kept drawing in a comfortable silence, Mark finding himself relaxing for the first time in days, maybe even years. There was something oddly therapeutic about simply sitting and drawing with a child. No expectations, no pressure, just the present moment. "I'm done," Sophie announced, turning the sketchpad to show her picture. It was a house, bigger than the first one, with an even more elaborate garden. But what caught Mark's attention were the three figures standing in front of the house, a woman, a girl, and a tall man. "Is it a family?" he asked softly. Sophie nodded. "An imaginary family. The mom, a girl like me, and—" She hesitated, glancing at Mark. "Someone who takes care of them." Mark felt something shift inside him, as if a locked door had begun to open. It was no longer just guilt or regret, nor simply the shock of this revelation. It was something deeper, more fundamental, the realization that this child, this little person with her drawings and her gentle wisdom, was part of him. "It's a beautiful drawing, Sophie," he said gently. "Can I keep it with you?" "Sure," she agreed easily. "We can make more tomorrow." "Tomorrow and every day you want," Mark promised, and for the first time in his adult life, he made a promise he was absolutely sure he would keep. On the other side of the room, Jessica opened her eyes briefly, watching the two of them leaning over the sketchpad. She closed her eyes again before they noticed, but a single tear slipped out, sliding silently down her cheek onto the pillow. The world she had built with such care, just her and Sophie against everything, was changing, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Jessica walked slowly down the hospital corridor, pushing the IV stand with one hand. The doctor insisted she start walking a bit to regain strength, but he warned her not to go too far. After 5 days in the hospital, she already felt trapped within those white walls. The pneumonia was responding well to treatment, but Dr. Reynolds wanted to keep her under observation for a few more days. Jessica hated hospitals. She hated feeling dependent, hated the smell of disinfectant, and especially hated the constant worry about how she would pay for it all once she left. Mark had assured her he would take care of the expenses, but that only increased her discomfort. Accepting his help meant opening a door she had kept firmly shut for 6 years. As she neared the waiting area, she heard Sophie's laughter. Jessica stopped, leaning against the wall. From where she stood, she could see part of the room without being seen. Sophie sat on the floor with Mark, both surrounded by building blocks he had brought that morning. "No, Mr. Mark. The tower's going to fall like that," Sophie giggled, trying to balance a red block on top of the shaky structure. "You're the expert," Mark replied, lifting his hands in surrender, his face lit up by a smile Jessica hadn't seen in years. Jessica watched in silence. There was something mesmerizing about the scene. Sophie so at ease with a man she barely knew. Mark so patient and attentive to a child who had entered his life so unexpectedly. "Look, it's almost up to the ceiling," Sophie exclaimed, standing on her tiptoes to add another block. "Careful," Mark said, lightly holding her waist so she wouldn't lose her balance. "We don't want you falling and ending up in a hospital bed like your mum." "Will Mummy get better soon?" Sophie asked, suddenly serious. "She will," Mark assured her. "She's strong, just like you." Sophie smiled, satisfied with the answer, and returned her attention to the tower. Mark watched her with an expression Jessica had never seen before, a mix of fascination, tenderness, and something deeper she couldn't name. A nurse walked by in the corridor, noticing Jessica leaning against the wall. "Miss Moore, do you need help getting back to your room?" "No," Jessica said quickly, putting a finger to her lips. "I'm fine. Just watching my daughter for a moment." The nurse glanced into the waiting room, saw Sophie and Mark, and smiled sympathetically before continuing on her way. Jessica remained there, motionless. Something inside her was slowly breaking, not painfully but more like ice melting after a long winter. Sophie said something that made Mark laugh again, a genuine, carefree laugh that Jessica hadn't heard from him in a very long time, and Sophie laughed along, that childlike laughter so pure and bright. The tears came without warning, hot and silent, rolling down Jessica's cheeks. She didn't bother wiping them away. As she watched father and daughter together, even though only one of them knew the truth, Jessica felt transported back in time. She remembered the first time she met Mark, in a college bookstore. He had accidentally knocked over a stack of books she was carrying, and instead of simply apologizing and walking away, he insisted on helping her carry them back to her dorm. She remembered their first kiss, nervous and awkward, at her dorm door after their third date. The tiny apartment they rented together in their junior year, so cramped it barely fit a bed, but which felt like a palace because they were together. The memories came in waves now, the plans they'd made. Mark talking about opening his own law firm, Jessica dreaming about a design career. They were going to change the world, make a difference, build an extraordinary life together. But then things started to change. Mark's internship at a major firm, the increasingly long hours, the promotions, the money, the status, all becoming more important than the shared dreams, than their time together. Jessica watched as the man she fell in love with slowly disappeared, replaced by someone obsessed with success and recognition. And then came the betrayal. The accidental discovery of messages exchanged with a colleague, the painful confrontation, the empty apologies, the end. Jessica swallowed hard, the bitter memories threatening to overwhelm her. But then her eyes returned to the waiting area. Mark was now on his knees on the floor, fully focused on balancing a blue block at the top of the tower, while Sophie stood with her hands on her hips, instructing him like a tiny authority figure. This image, this man kneeling to be at a child's level, listening intently to everything she said, did not match the memory of the ambitious, self-centered Mark she held on to. It was as if they were two different people. Suddenly, the tower collapsed with a crash, scattering colorful blocks everywhere. Sophie stared at the ruins for a moment, and Jessica held her breath, expecting tears. Instead, Sophie burst into laughter, throwing herself into Mark's arms. "Let's build a bigger one," she exclaimed. Mark hugged her, laughing along, and Jessica saw something in his eyes that took her breath away. Love. Pure, simple, unconditional love. The kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return, that comes without conditions or expectations. 6 years. Jessica had kept father and daughter apart for 6 years. At the time, she thought it was the right decision. Mark had made it clear that his career came first. What kind of father would he be? What kind of influence would he have on a young child? But watching them now, Jessica wondered if she had made a mistake. If, in her pain and anger, she had denied Sophie something precious, and denied Mark as well. Sophie deserved to grow up knowing who her father was. And what if Mark had changed? What if he could be the father Sophie deserved? The father Jessica never imagined he could be. The new tower was climbing higher now, this time with a broader, more stable base. Sophie and Mark worked together, focused, speaking quietly. It was all so natural, so right, it hurt to watch. Jessica remembered the guilt she felt when she discovered her pregnancy, how she briefly considered telling Mark, giving him a chance to be involved. But then pride took over, and fear too. Fear that he would reject the child, as he had rejected their relationship. Or worse, that he might want to be present only part-time, showing up when convenient, disappearing whenever work called. Was it better for a child to have an absent father, or to know of a father who was never really there? Jessica chose the first option, convinced she was sparing Sophie disappointment. But had she been unfair? Mark had never had a chance to choose. He never knew he had a daughter until he literally ran into her, holding the engagement ring he had once placed on Jessica's finger, along with promises he failed to keep. In the waiting area, the new tower was almost as tall as Sophie. She took a step back to admire it, tripped on a loose block on the floor and started to fall. Mark reacted instantly, catching her before she hit the ground. "I've got you," he said, holding her firmly. "Will you always catch me when I fall?" Sophie asked, looking at him with eyes so much like his own. Mark hesitated only for a second. "Whenever you need me, Sophie, I promise." Jessica brought her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. The tears now flowed freely. In that moment, she knew something had changed inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but an openness, a willingness to consider that there might be a place for Mark in their lives. Sophie deserved to know her father. And maybe, just maybe, Mark deserved to know his daughter. The block tower eventually toppled again. Sophie and Mark began gathering up the pieces for another attempt, laughing and talking as if they had known each other their entire lives. Jessica slipped away quietly, returning to her room. Her heart felt heavy, but somehow lighter at the same time. 6 years of certainties were beginning to crumble, just like the tower of blocks in the waiting room. When Mark brought Sophie back to the room later, Jessica didn't pretend to be irritated as she had on previous days. She didn't make any cutting remarks about how long they'd been gone. Instead, she just listened as Sophie excitedly described the towers they had built. "Mr. Mark said we can build an even bigger one tomorrow," Sophie finished, hopping onto the bed beside her mother. "That sounds like fun," Jessica said softly, surprising both Sophie and Mark with her positive response. You don't mind if I come back tomorrow?" Mark asked carefully, keeping his distance from the bed. Jessica looked at him, truly looked at him. For the first time in days, the man before her wasn't the same one she had left 6 years ago. There were new lines on his face, a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and she had been too busy looking at other things to notice. "Sophie would like that," she answered simply. The smile that lit up Mark's face was genuine, reaching his eyes, completely transforming his features. Jessica felt a strange pang in her chest, realizing how long it had been since she'd seen that particular smile. "Then I'll come back," he promised. After he left, Sophie looked at her mum curiously. "You're not mad at Mr. Mark today?" Jessica gave a faint smile, stroking her daughter's hair. "No, honey, I'm not mad. He's nice," Sophie stated with the simple directness of childhood. "He really listens to me, like you." Jessica felt tears threaten again, but she held them back. "Yes," she agreed. "He does seem to really listen." Later that night, after Sophie fell asleep in the armchair beside the bed, Jessica lay awake, thinking about a past she couldn't change, about a present that was shifting before her eyes, about a future that, for the first time in years, felt uncertain in a way that wasn't entirely terrifying. Mark would return tomorrow, and maybe she would be ready to start letting him into their lives, not for her sake. Her hurt and anger were still there, the wounds still real. But for Sophie, for that laughter that had echoed in the waiting room, for that promise, "Whenever you need me, Sophie, I promise." Life had a strange way of turning things around. 6 years ago, Jessica had vowed Mark Sullivan would never be part of her life again. Now lying in a hospital bed, she was beginning to accept that he might already be part of the only life that truly mattered, Sophie's. And as frightening as it was to admit, that idea didn't seem quite as terrible as before. Jessica was discharged from the hospital after 10 days. The doctors insisted she still needed rest, but at least she could recover at home. Mark arranged everything: an ambulance, the medication, a nurse who would come twice a day to administer the IV she still needed. The small apartment felt different when they arrived. There were flowers in a simple vase on the table, the fridge was stocked, and the place was spotlessly clean. "I asked a cleaning crew to come yesterday," Mark explained, carrying Jessica's small bag to her room. "I thought it'd be better for you to return to a fresh space." Jessica only nodded, too tired to argue. The past weeks had been an emotional whirlwind, and she was physically and mentally exhausted. "Sophie, why don't you show Mark your room while I rest a bit?" Jessica suggested, noticing the barely restrained excitement on her daughter's face. "Can I?" Sophie asked, looking between her mother and Mark. "Sure," Mark smiled. "I'd love to see it." Jessica watched them walk away, Sophie tugging Mark by the hand toward the small bedroom she'd decorated proudly with magazine cutouts and her own drawings. Over the past few days, Jessica's resistance had lessened considerably. Seeing Mark with Sophie triggered contradictory emotions, jealousy, fear, but also an unexpected relief at not carrying the burden alone anymore. She leaned back on the couch and closed her eyes. She could hear Sophie's excited voice as she showed off her treasures to Mark. Colorful stones she collected, the worn books she reread constantly, the small teddy bear missing an eye that had been her companion since she was a baby. At some point, Jessica dozed off. When she woke, the sky outside was already dark. Voices came from the tiny kitchen, and the smell of homemade food filled the apartment. "Careful with the hot water," she heard Mark say. "Here, hold it by the handle." "Like this?" Sophie's voice replied. "Perfect. You're a great kitchen helper." Jessica rose quietly and walked to the kitchen door. Mark and Sophie stood side by side at the tiny stove. He'd tied an improvised apron around Sophie, who could barely reach the counter even standing on a chair. They were making pasta, apparently, with Sophie in charge of stirring the sauce under Mark's watchful eye. The scene looked so domestic, so normal, that Jessica felt a tightness in her chest. Was this how it should have been? A family cooking dinner together, sharing little moments. "Mommy," Sophie called, noticing her, "we're making a surprise dinner." "I can see that," Jessica said with a slight smile. "Smells delicious. Mark taught me how to make real tomato sauce, not the stuff from a jar." Jessica noticed the absence of Mr. before Mark's name, a small change indicating how comfortable Sophie already felt with him. "I hope you don't mind," Mark said, a hint of nerves in his voice. "I figured you both needed a decent meal after all those days of hospital food." "It's fine," Jessica replied, surprised at the sincerity in her own voice. "Thank you." They ate at the small kitchen table, Sophie dominating the conversation with school stories and questions for Mark about his travels, his job, his apartment. Jessica mostly stayed quiet, observing the interaction, how Mark never mentioned money or status in his answers. Instead, he told funny stories about places he'd visited, people he'd met, lessons he'd learned. After dinner, Sophie asked to watch a cartoon on the small TV in the living room. Jessica agreed, and soon the girl was completely absorbed in her favorite show. Mark began washing the dishes, and Jessica, without much thought, picked up a towel to dry them. They worked in silence for a few minutes, moving carefully in the cramped space. "Jessica." Mark finally broke the silence, his voice low so Sophie wouldn't hear from the other room. "We need to talk." Jessica felt her body tense but nodded. She knew this moment would come eventually. They'd avoided serious conversations the past few days, focusing on her recovery and Sophie's well-being. "I know," she replied simply. They finished the dishes in silence. Jessica peeked in on Sophie, still captivated by the cartoon. "Let's go into the hallway," she suggested, grabbing her keys. "So we can talk without her hearing." The hallway of the building was empty and quiet. Jessica leaned against the wall opposite the apartment door, leaving it ajar so she could still hear if Sophie called. Mark stood in front of her, keeping a respectful distance. In the confined space, he seemed even taller, but his posture was cautious, almost hesitant. "Sophie is my daughter, isn't she?" he asked directly, but there was gentleness in his tone. Jessica looked down at the floor. Even though they'd touched on the subject at the hospital, she had never given a clear, final confirmation. Part of her still wanted to protect herself, protect Sophie, maintain control over the situation she had managed alone for so many years. "Jessica, please," Mark urged softly when she stayed quiet. "I need to hear you say it." She raised her eyes to meet his. "Yes," she finally said. "Sophie is your daughter." Mark closed his eyes for a moment, as though absorbing the final impact of that truth. When he opened them, they were moist. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" His voice was a rough whisper. Jessica felt the old hurt rising up, years of pain and resentment she'd tried to bury for Sophie's sake. "You weren't good to me, Mark. You didn't care. You cheated on me. Several times." The words spilled out like water from a dam finally breaking. "I loved you, but eventually I couldn't take the pain anymore, the loneliness in that relationship." She took a deep breath, fighting back tears threatening to fall. "Shortly after, I found out I was pregnant. I decided to raise Sophie alone. I didn't want her to go through what I did." Mark reeled as if physically struck. Tears began falling down his face, and he made no effort to hide them. "I had the right to know," he said, his voice trembling. "Regardless of what happened between us, I had the right to know I had a daughter. And she had the right to have a present father," Jessica countered, her own voice wavering. "Not someone who'd put her second like you did with me." Mark ran a hand over his face, wiping away tears. "How could you be so sure I'd do that? You never gave me a chance to prove otherwise." "I had 6 years of experience with you before she was born, Mark. You already showed me your priorities." A heavy silence fell between them. Mark stared at the floor, shoulders slumped. "I was young and stupid," he finally said, "obsessed with success, with recognition. I thought I was building something for us, but in the process, I destroyed what we had." He met Jessica's eyes, which were red with unshed tears. "I'm not excusing who I was. There's no excuse for what I did to you. But Jessica, if I had known about Sophie, I would have changed. I would have tried, at least." There was a sincerity in his voice that made something inside Jessica falter. "You can't know that," she said more softly. "No, I can't," he agreed. "But I know who I am now, and I know I would give anything, every cent, every achievement, to have been there for her first steps, her first words, to have known her from the start." Tears streamed down his face now, and Jessica felt her own slipping free. "I've lost 6 years of her life," Mark went on, voice choked. 6 years I'll never get back. I'm not blaming you. You did what you believed was right to protect her. But I'm asking, no, I'm begging, don't make me lose any more." Jessica closed her eyes, torn by conflicting emotions. The old hurt, the fear of being hurt again, the protective instinct for Sophie. But there was something else now. The image of Sophie laughing with Mark, the way her eyes lit up when he appeared, the genuine care he showed. "I don't know if I can trust you," she admitted. "Not with me, at least. But maybe with Sophie." The relief on Mark's face was palpable. "That's all I'm asking for," he said. "A chance to be the father she deserves." "I won't let her down, Jessica. I won't let either of you down." "Don't make promises you can't keep," Jessica warned. "This is one I intend to keep with every breath I have," Mark replied, an intensity in his voice that surprised her. What neither of them realized, focused as they were on their emotional conversation, was the small figure standing by the slightly open apartment door. Sophie had quietly left her cartoon, drawn by the voices in the hallway. Her big green eyes, so much like Mark's, were wide, absorbing every word of the revelation that would change her life forever. Sophie retreated silently, unnoticed by the adults. Her small steps made no sound on the hallway carpet as she re-entered the apartment, her child's mind trying to process what she had just discovered. Mark, the man who had shown up so suddenly in their lives, the man who built block towers with her and told her stories, the man who made her mom cry when she thought no one was looking. He wasn't just a family friend, he was her dad. Sophie glanced at the drawing she had made earlier, a make-believe family in front of a house. Now everything made sense, and yet none of it made sense. She picked up her small blue backpack, placed her one-eyed teddy bear inside, and silently slipped out the back door of the apartment, which led to the fire escape. Maybe if she found the place where she had first met Mark, she could better understand what was happening. Mark and Jessica stayed in the hallway a few minutes longer, each of them absorbing the weight of the conversation they'd just had. An odd tension hung between them, not anger, but a different kind of intensity. The truth was out, and there was no going back. "We should go back," Jessica finally said, wiping the last traces of tears. "Sophie will wonder why we're taking so long." Mark nodded, following her back into the apartment. Jessica opened the door, expecting to see Sophie still engrossed in her cartoon. The TV was on, but the living room was empty. "Sophie?" Jessica called, heading to the small bedroom. "Honey?" No response. Mark stood in the living room as Jessica checked the bathroom, then the kitchen, her worry growing with every passing second. "She must be hiding," Jessica said, her voice revealing the first hints of panic. "Sophie, this isn't funny. Come out." Mark started searching too, looking under the table, behind the sofa, in the kitchen cupboard, anywhere a small child might hide. "Sophie," he called, his own voice starting to sound alarmed. It was Jessica who noticed first. The small blue backpack Sophie always kept by the door was gone, and the one-eyed teddy bear she never left behind was missing as well. "The back door!" Jessica gasped, racing to the kitchen. The door leading to the fire escape was unlocked and ajar. The cold night air blew in, gently moving the curtains. "Oh my God," Jessica muttered, her blood turning to ice. She left. Sophie went out on her own. Mark froze for an instant, comprehending what that meant. A 5-year-old alone in the city at night. The terror of it made him react immediately. "We'll find her," he said, his voice firm despite the rising fear. "She can't have gone far." Jessica was already throwing on her coat, moving with a speed that ignored her recent illness. "She heard us," Jessica said, the horrible realization hitting her like a punch. "Sophie must have heard our conversation in the hallway." Mark felt the weight of that thought. His daughter, the daughter he'd just discovered he had overheard everything. The confirmation that he was her dad, the accusations, his tears of regret. How would she, at 5 years old, make sense of it all? "You take the front of the building. I'll go down the fire escape," Mark instructed, already heading to the kitchen door. "Call the police while we look." Jessica nodded, grabbing her phone with shaking hands. All the distance, all the coldness she had shown Mark for weeks was gone. Now they were just two terrified parents, united by the fear of losing their child. Mark descended the metal steps, calling Sophie's name with each landing. The night was cold, the sky overcast with dark clouds threatening rain. He tried to banish terrible thoughts from his mind. Sophie lost and frightened, or worse. "Sophie!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the alley behind the building. "Sophie, please, it's me, Mark." In the silence that followed, he realized Mark meant nothing special to her. Until a few hours ago, he was just a friend of her mother's who had suddenly appeared. "Sophie, I'm your dad." The words sounded strange in his mouth, but also strangely right. "Please, where are you?" Out in front of the building, Jessica ran from one side of the street to the other, asking everyone she encountered if they'd seen a small girl with wavy brown hair carrying a blue backpack. Most simply shook their heads sympathetically and went on their way. Some promised to keep an eye out. An older man mentioned seeing a child walking alone toward downtown, but wasn't sure if it was a girl or a boy. Jessica felt desperation grow with each passing minute. Her chest hurt, not from her recent pneumonia, but from the terror gripping her. Sophie was her entire life. The idea of losing her was unthinkable. The police finally arrived, asking questions, taking notes, requesting a recent photo. They promised to start searching immediately, but their professional expressions didn't hide the seriousness of the situation. A little child, alone at night in a big city, was high priority and high risk. Mark and Jessica found each other again in front of the building, both out of breath and red-eyed. "No sign of her in the back," Mark reported, running his hand through his hair in despair. "But I think I know where she might be." "Where?" Jessica asked, seizing any thread of hope. "She might have gone back to where we first met." "The main square, where she approached me with the ring." Jessica considered the idea for a moment. It made sense. Sophie had a surprisingly good sense of direction for her age. She knew how to get to school, to the park, to the corner store, and she knew how to reach downtown, as they occasionally went there for free events or just to walk around. "It's possible," she agreed, already moving in the direction he indicated. Let's go." They ran side by side through the streets, stopping at each corner to check in every direction, asking anyone they saw if they'd noticed Sophie. The rain began to fall, softly at first, then heavier, making the search even harder. "She'll be soaked," Jessica said, her voice breaking with worry. She didn't even take a raincoat. Mark took off his own coat and handed it to Jessica, who was shivering from both the cold and fear. "We'll find her," he promised, though the dread in his eyes belied the confidence in his tone. They pressed on, both drenched, desperation growing with every minute that ticked by. The police were searching too, with patrol cars roaming nearby streets and officers on foot checking alleys and parks. When they reached the main square, Mark spotted something. A small figure sitting on a bench in the rain, hugging something against her chest. Even from a distance, he recognized the wavy brown hair, now plastered to the little head by the downpour. "There!" he shouted, pointing. "It's her!" Jessica looked where he pointed and started running, Mark right behind her. Sophie lifted her head at the sound of their familiar voices. Her face was red and puffy from crying, and she clutched her teddy bear, now completely soaked. "Sophie!" Jessica called out, her voice choked with relief and fear. "Oh my God, Sophie!" The girl didn't move from the bench, watching them approach with wide eyes. There was confusion in her gaze, mixed with a deep sadness far too heavy for such a small child. Jessica reached her first, dropping to her knees in front of her, frantically checking if she was hurt. "Are you okay? Are you hurt? Why did you run away? Don't ever do that again." The words spilled out in a torrent, mingling worry, relief, and anger. Sophie just looked at her mother, then at Mark, who had stopped a few steps away, unsure what to do. The rain poured down on all three of them, but none seemed to notice. "Why did you lie?" Sophie finally asked, her tiny voice barely audible over the rain. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jessica felt tears mix with the rain on her face. How could she explain something so complicated to a child who was only just beginning to understand the world? "Oh, Sophie, I'm so sorry," she began, uncertain how to continue. Mark stepped forward, then knelt beside Jessica, bringing himself level with Sophie. Rainwater streamed down his face, but he didn't seem to care. "It was my fault," he said, his voice surprisingly clear despite the emotion. "I hurt your mom a long time ago, before you were born. She was trying to protect you from me." Sophie stared at him intently, her green eyes, so much like his, shimmering with tears she hadn't yet let fall. "Are you really my dad?" she asked outright. Mark felt his heart clench. "Yes," he answered simply. "I am your dad." Sophie hugged the teddy bear tighter. "Why didn't you come see me before now?" "Because I didn't know about you," Mark replied honestly. "If I had known, I would have come. I would have been here from the beginning." Sophie looked at Jessica, who nodded through trembling lips. "I didn't tell him, Sophie," she admitted, "and that was wrong. I should have told him." "So I'm sorry." The child processed their words, her little face revealing a comprehension beyond her years. Finally, she looked back at Mark. "Are you going away now that you know?" she asked, fear evident in her voice. "No," Mark answered firmly, reaching out to gently touch her face for the first time as her father. "Never. I'll never stop looking for you, Sophie. I won't leave." Something in his unwavering tone seemed to break Sophie's last resistance. She threw herself into his arms, sobbing into his chest. Mark held her tight, tears running freely down his cheeks, blending with the rain. Jessica watched for a moment, feeling a whirlwind of emotions: relief, guilt, fear, and something dangerously close to hope. Then she joined the embrace, wrapping her arms around Sophie from behind and placing her hands on Mark's arms. For a brief moment, they were a single unit, united by the child between them, by the storm drenching them, by the mutual fear they had just faced. The rain began to subside, but none of them moved. Sophie eventually pulled back a little, looking up at Mark with eyes far too serious for a 5-year-old. "Are you going to do to me what you did to Mommy?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you going to make me suffer too?" The question hit Mark like a physical blow. It was so direct, so raw, and so heartbreakingly perceptive from someone so young. He felt Jessica tense beside him, probably wondering how he would answer. Mark knelt there in the rain, ignoring the water soaking through his clothes, gazing directly into her eyes, the eyes that mirrored his own. "Never, Sophie," he said, his voice thick with emotion but steady in conviction. "I can't change what I did, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be better for you." Sophie placed her small hands on his cheeks, studying his face as though searching for any hint of a lie. What she saw must have satisfied her, because slowly a shy smile appeared on her lips. "I always wanted a dad," she said simply. Mark felt his heart break, and then somehow mend in that single instant. "And I always wanted a daughter," he replied. "I just didn't know it until I met you." Jessica watched them, feeling both part of the scene and an outsider. Years of hurt and fierce protection wouldn't vanish overnight. But seeing Mark and Sophie together, seeing the instant and deep connection between them, she started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go of the past. "Let's go home," she said softly. "We're all soaked, and Sophie needs a warm bath." Mark looked at her, surprised and grateful at once for that implied inclusion. "Let's," he agreed, picking Sophie up easily in his arms. As they walked back, Sophie's head resting on Mark's shoulder, her hand firmly holding Jessica's, the rain finally stopped. The clouds began to clear, revealing a starry sky above them, the first clear night in a long time. The apartment was quiet when they returned, everyone drenched and emotionally exhausted. Jessica took Sophie straight to the bathroom, filling the tub with warm water, while Mark phoned the police to say they had found her. "They said they'll send someone to verify she's safe," Mark reported, when Jessica came back to the living room after tucking Sophie into bed. "Thank you," Jessica said, rubbing her tired eyes, "for calling them and for helping find her." An awkward silence fell between them. The desperate unity they had shared while searching for Sophie was gone, replaced by uncertainty now that the immediate crisis was over. The truth was out in the open, and there was no turning back. "What happens now?" Mark asked quietly, mindful not to wake Sophie. Jessica looked out the window, watching the raindrops still sliding down the glass. "I'm not exactly sure," she admitted, "but I know Sophie needs stability right now. She's confused, scared." "I want to be in her life," Mark said resolutely. "I want to know her, support her, be present." Jessica turned to face him, her expression a mix of complex emotions. "Sophie deserves that," she agreed. "She deserves to have her father in her life, but Mark and I need time. Time to trust that you won't vanish when things get hard. Time to believe Sophie really is a priority to you." Mark nodded slowly, accepting her conditions. "I understand," he said, "and I'll prove it, Jessica. Day by day, I'll prove I can be the father Sophie deserves." The police arrived shortly after, confirming that Sophie was safe and offering advice on dealing with the trauma of the incident. Mark stayed until Jessica fell asleep on the couch, too exhausted to move to her bed. He covered her with a blanket, checked on Sophie one last time, and left quietly, promising to return in the morning. In the weeks that followed, a new routine began to form. Mark showed up every morning before going to the office, bringing coffee for Jessica and helping prepare Sophie's breakfast. At first, the interactions were tense, guarded. Jessica watched his every move, every word spoken to Sophie, as though waiting for him to show his true colors. But that moment never came. Instead, Mark started rearranging his life around Sophie. He canceled business trips, delegated major tasks, arrived at the office later and left earlier. His phone, once constantly in his hand, remained forgotten in his pocket whenever he was with his daughter. "Don't you have to be at work now?" Jessica asked one afternoon when Mark showed up to pick Sophie up from school, something he'd begun to do regularly. "We rescheduled the meeting," he replied simply. "I promised Sophie I'd take her to the park today." Jessica studied his face, looking for resentment or impatience. She found none, only genuine determination and, surprisingly, a sense of peace she had never seen in him before. Over time, Jessica's defenses slowly came down. She allowed Mark to take Sophie for entire afternoons, then an entire Saturday, eventually even a weekend. He never disappointed, always punctual, always attentive to Sophie's needs, always respectful of Jessica's boundaries. 1 month turned into 2, then 3. Winter gave way to spring, and with the changing season, something also began to bloom among the 3 of them. Mark met Sophie's teachers, memorized the names of her friends, learned her favorite foods and which bedtime stories she loved. He discovered she was terrified of cockroaches, that she loved strawberry ice cream, that she dreamed of having a dog someday. Every new detail was a precious treasure, each moment spent together helping fill the void of lost years. "Can I talk to you?" Mark asked Jessica one Sunday afternoon, while Sophie played with other children at the park. Jessica nodded, sitting beside him on a bench. "I want to thank you," he said, surprising her, "for giving me this chance, for not shutting me out completely after everything." Jessica watched Sophie running around, her laughter reaching them even from a distance. "I didn't do it for you," she answered honestly. "I did it for her." "I know," Mark said, "and that's why it means so much. You put her happiness above your own feelings about me." Jessica looked at him, truly looked, noticing the subtle changes the past months had brought. The worry lines around his eyes had softened. His gaze, once often distant, was now present, focused. He somehow looked younger, lighter. "She loves you," Jessica said simply. Mark's face lit up at those words. "I love her too, more than I ever imagined possible." 4 months after the night Sophie ran away, Mark showed up at the apartment with a proposal. "I found a bigger place," he said, showing photos of a spacious 3-bedroom apartment. "I thought maybe you two would like to move. It's closer to Sophie's school. There's a park out front and enough room for everyone." Jessica looked at the photos, feeling that familiar impulse to retreat and protect her hard-earned independence. "Mark, I'm not suggesting we live together," he clarified quickly. "The apartment has a separate entrance for the back section. It's like 2 connected apartments. You and Sophie would have your own space, and I'd have mine. That way Sophie wouldn't have to choose between us. She could have both parents nearby." The idea was tempting. Jessica's current apartment was too small and not ideally located. Her health had improved, but medical bills had drained all her savings. "I'd pay my share," she stated firmly. "I never doubted you would," Mark said with a small smile. When they told Sophie about the idea, her enthusiasm was immediate and boundless. "Are we going to be like a real family?" she asked, her eyes shining. Jessica and Mark exchanged uncertain looks. "We'll be a family," Mark said carefully. "Maybe not in the traditional way, but still a family." That seemed to satisfy Sophie, who immediately began making plans for her new room. Moving day came on a sunny summer Saturday. Jessica's friends helped, along with some of Mark's colleagues who volunteered to carry the heavier furniture. By evening, exhausted but content, the 3 of them sat on the floor of the new living room, surrounded by unpacked boxes, eating pizza straight from the box. "I like it here," Sophie declared, looking around with approval. "It feels right." Jessica watched her daughter, noticing how different she seemed compared to a few months ago. Her smile was back to full force. Her eyes sparkled with renewed confidence. The shadow of insecurity that had hovered since the night she ran away had finally lifted. Then she looked at Mark, who was telling Sophie how they could plant flowers on the small balcony. He had kept every promise he made. He had reorganized his entire life around Sophie. No complaints, no hesitation. He respected Jessica's limits, acknowledged her fears, and patiently worked to prove he could be trusted. He wasn't forgiven, not completely. The wounds were too deep to heal so quickly. But for the first time in years, Jessica allowed herself to consider the possibility that people could change, that the past didn't have to define the future. "What do you think, Jessica?" Mark's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Roses or daisies on the balcony?" "Daisies," she answered, meeting his gaze. "They're tougher." Mark smiled, understanding the unspoken message. Later that night, after Sophie finally fell asleep in her new room, Jessica found Mark in the kitchen, finishing up putting dishes away. "Thank you," she said simply. Mark turned kind surprised. "For what?" "For not giving up. For proving I was wrong about you." Mark shook his head slightly. "You weren't wrong. I was exactly what you said I was. But I'm not that person anymore." Jessica nodded slowly. "I'm beginning to see that it wasn't full forgiveness, nor reconciliation. It was something simpler, and perhaps more important. Recognition. Recognition that people can change, that mistakes can be repaired, that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt, slowly, carefully, day by day." Sophie had two parents now, two imperfect adults learning to set aside their own wounds for her sake. Two adults who, despite everything, still remembered why they had once loved each other. And that, for the moment, was enough. 6 months had passed since the move to the shared apartment. A comfortable routine had set in, with Mark living in the rear section, while Jessica and Sophie occupied the main area. The wounds of the past hadn't disappeared, but they were healing day by day, moment by moment. Sophie was the center of this new arrangement, flourishing with both parents present in her life. Her smile was back at its brightest, and she spoke excitedly at school about "my dad," words that still sounded strange yet wonderful to Mark every time he heard them. It was on a seemingly ordinary Wednesday that something changed. Mark was helping Sophie with her homework at the kitchen table while Jessica cooked dinner. His phone rang, and Jessica watched surreptitiously as he checked the number and answered. "Sullivan," he said, his tone instantly shifting to the professional, confident Mark she remembered from years ago. "Yes, I see. No, that's excellent news." Jessica continued chopping vegetables, pretending not to pay attention, but noticing every subtle change in his expression and the contained excitement in his voice. "We can close the deal tomorrow? Great. I'll be there at 9. He hung up, a discreet smile on his lips. "Good news?" Jessica asked casually, dumping the vegetables into the pot. "You could say that," Mark replied, looking at her with an unreadable expression. "Jessica, would you have dinner with me tomorrow night? Just the two of us?" The question caught her off guard. Over the past months, they'd formed a cordial, sometimes friendly relationship, but always with Sophie as their focal point, the bridge between them. They rarely spent time alone. "There's something important I want to talk to you about," Mark added, seeing her hesitation. "I can stay with Mrs. Miller, Mom," Sophie interjected, revealing she was listening despite appearing focused on her homework. "She said I can visit her kitten any time." Jessica and Mark exchanged a small, amused look at their daughter's convenient suggestion. "All right," Jessica finally agreed. "Tomorrow night." The next day, after dropping Sophie off with the neighbor, Jessica waited in the living room, feeling uncharacteristically nervous. She had chosen a simple dress, more out of a desire to break from routine than for any other reason she was willing to admit to herself. Mark arrived on the dot, also dressed with more care than usual. He took her to a small, cozy Italian restaurant, nothing like the ostentatious places he used to frequent in the past. "You look lovely," he commented after they ordered, left alone with 2 glasses of wine. "Thank you," Jessica replied, taking a small sip to hide her discomfort. "So what did you want to talk about?" Mark smiled, recognizing her impatience. "Straight to the point. Some things haven't changed." "Some things don't," she agreed, a slight smile curving her lips involuntarily. "And others change completely," he continued, meeting her gaze over the rim of his glass. "We have changed, Jessica." A comfortable silence settled between them, not the awkward silence of their early encounters, but something calmer, like a pause between movements of a familiar piece of music. "We really have," Jessica finally said. "I never imagined we'd be here, talking like friends." "Neither did I," Mark admitted. "But I'm grateful we are. Grateful you gave me the chance to know Sophie, to be part of her life." Jessica studied his face, noticing the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes, the extra gray at his temples. This wasn't the brash, impatient young man she once knew and loved. He was a different man, more mature, more grounded. "What happened to you, Mark?" "In those years we were apart." The question emerged naturally, without accusation, just genuine curiosity. Mark looked down at his wine for a moment, as though searching for the right words. After we ended, I threw myself even deeper into work. I built my career, made money, earned recognition. He paused, a sad smile touching his lips. Then one day, sitting in my office after closing the biggest deal of my career, I realized I had no one to celebrate with, no one who really cared. Jessica listened intently, finally hearing the other side of the story they once shared. It was like waking from a trance, Mark continued. I realized I'd lost the only person who truly mattered to me, chasing things that, in the end, brought no real happiness. And then you found Sophie, Jessica said softly. And then I found Sophie, he agreed, emotion evident in his voice, and discovered what really matters. Their entrees arrived, interrupting the conversation. They ate in silence for a few minutes, each digesting the words that had been exchanged. What about you, Jessica? Mark asked eventually. How were those years for you? Jessica drew a deep breath, sorting out her thoughts. Hard, she admitted, but also full of joy because of Sophie. She was my strength when I thought I couldn't keep going, my light in the darkest days. Mark nodded, understanding. I'm sorry you went through it all alone, he said sincerely. If I had known. But you didn't know, Jessica interrupted gently. And I chose not to tell you. We both made mistakes, Mark. Yours before, mine after. Can we move on? He asked, vulnerability clear in his eyes. Not to forget the past, but maybe to forgive it, to make the most of what we still have. Jessica felt intense emotion at his words. Forgiveness was a journey she was only beginning. I'm trying, she answered honestly, day by day. Watching you with Sophie, how you've changed for her, and it helps. Mark smiled, a smile that reached his eyes. I have something to show you, he said, subtly shifting the topic. After dinner, if you don't mind. They finished the meal talking about lighter things, shared memories, funny stories about Sophie at school. It was surprising how, despite everything, there was still comfort in each other's familiarity. After dinner, Mark drove them to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, lined with neat houses and tree-lined streets. He stopped in front of a two-story house with a large front yard and a welcoming porch. What is this? Jessica asked, puzzled. Come see, Mark replied, stepping out and opening the car door for her. Intrigued, Jessica followed him to the front door. Mark pulled out a key from his pocket and unlocked it, motioning for her to enter. Inside, it was spacious and welcoming. Soft-colored walls, light, hardwood floors. A large living room with a fireplace, an open kitchen with a central island, big windows that would let in plenty of natural light. It looked perfect, though unfurnished. It's beautiful, she commented, still confused. But I don't get it. I bought this house, Mark explained, watching her reaction carefully. For you both. So Sophie can have a yard to play in, so you can have space to work on your designs, and so we can have a new start. Jessica felt her heart race. Mark, I can't accept this. It's too much. I'm not giving it only to you, he clarified. I'm giving it to us as a family, not as a couple, but as Sophie's parents. She deserves to grow up in a place like this. He guided her through the house, pointing out the rooms, explaining his ideas. Upstairs, he stopped at a closed door. This would be Sophie's room, he said, opening it. Jessica held her breath. Unlike the rest of the empty house, this room was fully decorated. Light pink walls, a carriage-shaped bed, a built-in bookcase filled with colorful books, neatly arranged toys, and a row of teddy bears of varying sizes and colors. A large window overlooked the backyard, where a swing hung from a big tree, waiting for a child's laughter. You did all this? She asked, deeply moved. I wanted it to be perfect for her, Mark replied. For both of you. Jessica walked around the room, touching the books, feeling the softness of the teddy bears. Every detail had been chosen with so much care, so much love. There's a room downstairs that could become your design studio, Mark went on, and the main bedroom is yours, of course. What about you? Jessica asked, finally finding her voice. There's a small guest house out back, he explained. I'd stay there, close enough to be in Sophie's life, but still giving you both the space and privacy you need. Jessica didn't know how to respond. The gesture was overwhelming in its generosity, and frightening too. Don't say anything now, Mark suggested gently. Think about it. Talk to Sophie. 2 weeks later, on a sunny Sunday afternoon, the move was complete. Jessica had accepted the offer under the condition that she would contribute financially once her small design business became profitable. Sophie was overjoyed with the new house, especially her dream bedroom. That was where Mark found her, sitting on the backyard swing, slowly swaying while holding something in her hands. Approaching, he saw it was the old engagement ring, the one Sophie had tried to sell when everything began. "What are you doing with that, princess?" he asked, sitting on the grass beside the swing. Sophie looked at the ring, turning it in her fingers so the small sapphire caught the sunlight. "I was thinking," she answered, her voice quiet yet earnest. "About what? How everything changed because of it." Mark glanced at the piece of jewelry, recalling the day he bought it, filled with hopes and plans. He never could have imagined the journey that little object would set in motion. "I think you're right," he agreed. "It really did change everything." Sophie slipped off the swing and sat down next to her dad on the grass. "Dad," Sophie said suddenly, "there's a girl in my class, Sarah. Her mom's sick, like Mom was. She's really sad." Mark studied his daughter, curious where she was going with this. "That is sad, sweetheart." Sophie opened her hand, showing him the ring resting on her palm. "I want to give this to her," she declared, "so she can sell it and help her mom like I tried to do." Mark felt a lump in his throat at his daughter's innocent generosity. "Sophie, that's very kind, but the ring is worth a lot of money. Maybe we can help Sarah in another way." Sophie shook her head, determined. "It has to be the ring. It's magic, Dad. This ring saved my mom, and it saved you too." Mark didn't know how to respond. His daughter's childlike perspective carried a deep truth he couldn't put into words. From the porch, Jessica watched father and daughter together. She walked over slowly, curious about their intense conversation. "What are you two up to?" she asked, stopping next to them. Sophie eagerly explained her plan to help her classmate, showing the ring. "Are you sure, Sophie?" Jessica asked, surprised by her daughter's intention. "That ring is part of our story." "Exactly," Sophie insisted. "That's why it needs to help someone else now to write a new story." Jessica and Mark exchanged glances over their daughter's head, both touched by the unexpected wisdom of this small person they had raised. "If that's what you want, then we'll do it together," Jessica agreed. Sophie hugged her mom, then her dad, and skipped back to the swing, the ring firmly in her hand. That left Mark and Jessica side by side in the sunny backyard. "She's incredible," Mark remarked, watching Sophie swing happily. "Yes, she is," Jessica agreed, her eyes fixed on her daughter. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind of silence only possible between people who have shared so much pain and so much joy, so many mistakes and so many chances at redemption. "You've changed, Mark," Jessica finally said in a gentle tone. "I can see it. It's still not easy, but I'm willing to let you stay close. For our daughter's sake." Mark nodded, too moved to speak at first. When he found his voice, it was filled with sincerity. "It's more than I deserve," he said, "and I'll do everything I can to be worthy of this chance you're both giving me." "Mom, Dad," Sophie called from the swing. "Come push me." They looked at each other again, sharing a small, mutual smile. They weren't together as a couple. That story ended years ago. But they were together as a family, united by the love for the little person calling out to them. Side by side, they walked toward Sophie, toward a future they were building step by step, choice by choice. An imperfect, complicated future, yet a real one. A future healed by their decisions, shaped not only by past mistakes but by present commitments. True love can be quiet, later and filled with flaws, but when it finds courage, it rebuilds homes, heals wounds, and transforms what remains into something new and profoundly beautiful. And that, for them, was enough. If this story touched your heart, Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.